First of all, good morning to everybody, and thank you for agreeing to listen my broken English. I can't speak any Hebrew, unfortunately. So the thing that I want to talk about today is how not to scale Agile. Because scaling and making Agile bigger is a huge topic in our industry. There's a new scaling framework coming up every week, and whether it's for large enterprises or for serious enterprises or for disciplined enterprises or for rational enterprises, and all these kind of really interesting things are coming up. And there's a big danger in how people start approaching these things. So I want to talk a bit about why large-scale initiatives tend to fail. And then I want to talk about what I think is a really important missing piece from a lot of Agile implementations out there, and maybe give you some ideas how you can improve your own process. There's a lovely case study published by a guy called Agile Israel, and it's titled "Why FBI Cannot Build a Case Management System." And it's a case study of FBI trying to replace their Sentinel system built in COBOL or something like that. And it's been well documented in IEEE. You can download the case study online. Mary Poppendick wrote about that in her latest book as well. And the story goes something like this. FBI figured out that they have this outdated system they need to replace, and they did what any big government organization does. So they wrote down all the features that the old system had. They published a request for proposals for somebody to deliver it. And I think Lockheed Martin won the request for proposal. They asked for $90 million to do it. $90 million, and a few years later, somebody realized that this is never going to work. Because as you're replacing an old system with a new one, you can't just do everything that the old system did, because there's kind of 30 years of workarounds, and then everybody started blaming everybody else. The software company started blaming the business analysts for not describing the requirements correctly. The kind of customer started blaming the software company for not delivering. And kind of at the end, because everybody had kind of really good lawyers, they decided that it's actually a success. They're just going to shut it down and start completely fresh. And the big risk was, let's not spend $90 million again, just not knowing what's going on. So they wanted to do it iteratively. And they published another request for proposal saying, we want the same thing, but we want to have control every month to see how the project is going, and we want to have an option to stop it or proceed, which is kind of iterative delivery. Brilliant. Everybody said this is amazing. Somebody else won the contract, and about $360 million later, they realized it's never going to come together. It's kind of not going ahead. It's going too slow. It's too many problems. It's not going to be finished. And the big question that everybody had is, why did it take them 4 times as long and 4 times more money to understand that this is not going anywhere? We're doing things iteratively and looking at it every month, compared to doing kind of one big delivery. And one of the conclusions that Jerome had is that the measurements they had for progress were completely wrong. The measurements they had for progress were all about effort. They were all about complexity. They were all about how many function points, story points got delivered over time. So every month when kind of the delivery team came together with the project steering committee, was like, oh, we committed to deliver these many points, we delivered those many points, that's brilliant. Nobody cared what those points actually mean, or whether they're any useful or anything like that. And the big conclusion that Jerome had is, if the only metrics you have around progress are tied to effort, tied to the complexity of the software delivering, you are basically in for a disaster. Because it's going to be even more difficult to decide, is this going somewhere or not? And there's lots of these zombie projects that are not dead, that are not alive. They've not delivered anything useful, but we can't really stop them because it looks like something's happening. And only a few years ago, there was this big thing at the BBC in the UK where there was a project called My BBC, kind of designed for people to personalize their BBC experience. And there was a report published in the Register that said, you know, they evaded scrutiny. They spent £75 million, and they were flying under the radar to spend all that money because they were agile. And because they were agile, every month they could say, oh, you know, we delivered some business value. And every month they were changing what business value actually meant. So they started from a concept of they're going to have, I don't know how many active users, and then they decided, oh, that's not realistic, so we're going to have registered users, and then this number is wrong, we're going to have some other number. They were able to replan all the time. Now, kind of the idea with Agile is that the benefit is that you can replan all the time. But if we get to the position where replanning all the time is just a way for us to hide a zombie project and spend a lot more money, then we're actually not delivering any value. We're failing horribly. And this is kind of a big, big problem with lots and lots and lots of how Agile is implemented out there, because the biggest measurement of progress people have are story points. Most people in this room, statistically, are going to do something like story points to measure progress. We're going to have burn-up charts and burn-down charts, and that's the big, big, big measurement of progress, but it's not. Story points measure how much time and money you've spent building software. They don't measure that you've delivered anything useful. And this is kind of going to the same problem that Jerome wrote about in Why FBI Can't Deliver a Case Management System. The only measurement of progress most people have today in the Agile community is a metric purely tied to effort. It's not tied to any value delivered. So this leads to kind of two really, really interesting problems with managing projects. The first one is something that kind of, the buzzword for this is squirrel-driven project management. Which is, anything is a good idea, and we can change plans now, and then tomorrow, this is a good idea, so let's do that, and then this is a good idea, let's do that. And it's a brilliant, brilliant way to get people and keep people busy all the time, but it's a horrible way to actually deliver something useful. And just because we can change direction every week, doesn't mean we should. And the other big problem that kind of this leads to is we have this projects that kind of go on and go on and go on, and everybody's happy because we delivered a ton of small things, but at the end, it's really just not coming together. I worked with a team that spent about 3 years delivering brilliant user stories for clients where every time another manager says, oh, this is the most important thing for me now, they completely switch gears and they start delivering this thing new, and then 3 years later, when the client ran out of money and decided to shut down the project, everybody was unhappy because, hey, you know, all these user stories that we delivered, they don't actually add up to a product. And you can't go live with that. And this is completely insane. This is not what Agile is supposed to be, but this is how we tend to scale stuff up. Spend more money, get more people involved, make it even more effort. The other big problem that this often leads to is what Jeff Patton brilliantly described as Underpants-Gnomes progress reporting. And the metaphor comes from this South Park cartoon where in one episode, everybody's underwear disappears. In the town of South Park, nobody has any more clean underwear. And the children of South Park decide to kind of figure out what the mystery is. So they get a new pair of underwear, they put it in a drawer, they set up a trap, they set up a lamp, and then in the middle of the night they hear a sound, they turn the lamp on, and they see this guy trying to steal the underwear. They follow him to a cave where there's lots and lots and lots of these guys jumping around, they're very busy, they're moving underwear in carts and things like that. They say, well, why are you doing this? He says, well, we are the Underpants-Gnomes, we are #1 in collecting underwear. So, but why? Well, this is our mission. So what is your mission? To collect all the underwear. Well, why? So, well, you know, we are the Underpants-Gnomes. We are collecting underwear. So why? So, well, you have to go and ask the planning gnome about that. And then they go, you know, and find the planning gnome, and the planning gnome is standing in front of a planning board like this. And The major problem with lots and lots of software projects is this is exactly how we plan and report on them. We have all these user stories that we need to do, and yes, I've done 5 user stories this week, I've done 10 user stories next week, and then magic, and then, we're going to get profit. It's going to be amazing, it's going to be brilliant, it's going to be the best product ever. And there's a big problem with the gap in between. Because the value metrics we use on user stories tend to be very, very small and oriented towards something that you can deliver this week. The value metrics that kind of customers want or the product people want are all about profit, market share. They're all moving on kind of 6-month cycles, 1-year cycles. By the time we kind of figure out what's going on, it's too late. And, there's this whole misconception that we should kind of get the clients to tell us what they want, and then we go and deliver that, and that's value. This is horribly wrong. And that's what most people in software don't understand. There's a lovely, lovely, lovely book I strongly recommend everybody reads that's doing anything related to IT. It's called What Customers Want by Anthony Ulrich. Anthony was in charge of the second worst product launch in history. He directly spent $500 million and indirectly spent $1.2 billion on doing exactly what his customers told him they want, and then horribly failed at the end. And because this was IBM, they can survive $1.7 billion of wasted money, but most other companies cannot. And one of big conclusions that Anthony had is customers don't know what they want. They will tell you one thing, they want another thing. They can't express what they want. They're overly focused on providing solutions. They're not focused on giving you a description of a problem. And even when they provide a solution, because they're not IT experts, they don't know what's possible. They give you the kind of stuff they think how things should work. And all these things combined create a big problem where we create a plan with lots and lots of teeny things to do people told us they want, and then magic. And then at the end, kind of, who knows what happens. So the next time you see something like this, just imagine yourself holding other people's dirty underwear, because that's what this thing is. This is let's collect all the underwear. The font is intentionally small. I don't expect you to read this, but you can recognize it's kind of some stupid list of user stories. And the big problem with something like this is the only kind of reporting we can do on this is Underpants-Gnomes reporting. Because there's no connection in the middle. There's no phase number 2. It's all about, we're going to do all these things, and then magically, because somebody told us this is useful, this thing is going to happen. So there's a couple of problems with this. And one of the problems with this is that just because somebody said they want something doesn't actually make it a good idea. Like Anthony Ulrich discovered, you can go and do exactly what your customers told you they want, but nobody wants to buy it because humans are unpredictable. Or kind of, they're not to be trusted completely, or their opinion changes over time and things like that. There's a lovely piece of statistics from Microsoft published by a guy called Ron Kohavi. And you can download this if you Google for online experimentation at Microsoft. Ron went back to some grand initiatives launched at Microsoft and tried to figure out how many of the things that were actually promised came true. When people said, let's do all these brilliant things and then magic and then profit, did we actually get that profit or not? And his conclusion is that at Microsoft, about 1/3 of what they started doing moved the numbers that they wanted to move in the right direction. About 1/3 created no statistically relevant change. And about 1/3 actually damaged the numbers they were supposed to improve. And in the paper, he also quotes Amazon, that is considered the best in class in the industry in terms of getting business value for software features. And he says that at Amazon, the success rate is slightly below 50%. Now, what that means is that if your company is anywhere on the line between good and great, about 2/3 to 1/2 of stuff in your product backlog are just bad ideas. They're not bad ideas because anybody's stupid or people are wrong. It's difficult to come up with good ideas. And it's difficult to validate them. And it's very difficult to kind of know which of these things are actually the ones that are going to deliver value. So imagine being able to delete 2/3 of your backlog that you know is not really going to deliver any value. How much faster can you go? And would you even need to scale up to 300 people, or could you deliver the same thing with 20? And this is kind of really, really interesting as a thing to think about, because most of the time when we talk about scaling, we talk about spending more money. Kind of, this is scaling, we want to hire 50 more people. We want to build something bigger. And people are always talking about kind of building stuff bigger, spending more money, not delivering a bigger outcome. Anthony's big conclusion, his $1.7 billion lesson, is that plans should not be focused on tasks, they should be focused on outcomes that you want to achieve. And we need to figure out the answer to the Underpants-Gnomes question so we can measure whether we're achieving those outcomes on a shorter time scale, so we can actually decide which of the things that we are working on are good ideas, which of the things are not good ideas. And the problem with kind of good and bad ideas is not a particularly new one. There's a lovely book by a British economist called Tim Harford. The book is called Adapt. And Adapt talks about why linear plans always fail. Linear plans as a sequence of things that is going to kind of happen. And he talks about how linear plans fail in economy, in civil engineering, in social sciences, in the military, everywhere. Not just software. It's not a software book at all. And he talks about lots of different reasons how humans are unpredictable, business opportunities change as we're delivering, we don't have perfect knowledge and things like that. And then he actually finds, in the book, he describes a three-piece rule, how to create plans that deliver value in face of incomplete information, in face of kind of changing environments, from a guy who invented lean startup about 150 years ago. And he calls these principles Palchinsky principles, after this Russian engineer who kind of proposed those plans for civil engineering. He says good plans that kind of deliver this stuff have three components. The first component is variation. Variation as in try lots of different things. Some of them are going to work out, some of them are not going to work out. We statistically know that some of them are not going to be good, but we need to have lots of variation in our plans. What that means, translated to software today, is that stories should be options, not commitment and scope. The backlog of stories we have shouldn't mean that, oh, we're going to deliver these things. It should mean that, hey, some of these things are good ideas, some of them are stupid ideas. We're going to actively figure out which is which, and then maybe deliver a piece of this, not everything. So the other principle that kind of Harford defined is survivability, as in you should not be required to spend 75 million pounds to realize that this is not going the right direction. Or even worse, you shouldn't spend $1.7 billion understanding that this is a bad product. And actually kind of, when it comes to stories, theoretically, this is the place where stories should be good, because we all talk about stories that are small, stories that are kind of sliced, stories that are deliverable inside an iteration. And for most people, stories need to be small so that, they can fit into 2 weeks of work. That's irrelevant. Stories need to be small because if they turn out to be a bad idea, we don't want to fail horribly. We want to be able to spot bad ideas quickly. And this is where the third Palchinsky principle comes in, and that's the principle of selection. Not selection in terms of prioritizing the work we want to do, selection in terms of deciding after we've delivered a piece of work, was it a good idea or not? Now, just think about this from this perspective. If the research that Ron Kohavi published was right, about at least 1/2 of the things you delivered last year were bad ideas. At least 1/2. How many of those things have you removed from production after they were delivered to production? Have you removed anything? And if not, why are you paying twice as much for software maintenance and software testing? Why are you slowing yourself by 2 times? Nobody really looks at this stuff. We in software are incredibly bad looking at selection. Variation is easy. People can come up with lots of user stories. Getting stories to be survivable is also relatively easy today. We've learned how to do that. This one, we are really, really bad at as an industry. So stories need to have a criteria, to have a measurement for whether they were a good idea or not. And not from a perspective of have we delivered what we promised to deliver. Acceptance criteria, that's you need that anyway. But was the story we delivered actually a good idea? And this becomes really interesting from a perspective of how do we measure this on a shorter time scale, not 6 months later. Yes, I can measure profit, market share, and all these things 6 months later, but that's too late to tell me which of the stories I'm working on this week are good ideas. And how do we measure this stuff? And this is where we come back to kind of the Underpants-Gnomes problem. So if you look at kind of something like this, it's very, very difficult to know that this particular thing actually was a good idea or a bad idea. We can talk about, well, does it do what the project sponsor told me it needs to do? Is it yellow? Is it nice? Is it all these beautiful things? But kind of, how do we know if it was actually a good idea or not? And this is kind of a big problem, because when people talk about roadmaps in software, they mostly talk about stuff like this. And roadmaps like this are useless. That's what Hartford talks about. We cannot use roadmaps like this. If you look at real roadmaps look a lot more like this. This is a roadmap. The trick is in the name. It's a map of roads. This is not a map of roads. This is a single road going through a tunnel, where on one end we come in, on the other end we go out, and then and that's the big problem. So kind of roadmaps like this have all the aspects that Hartford talks about. There's a lot of variation. If I want to go from here to there, there's 20, 30 different options I can do. With a roadmap like this, you never, ever, ever want to go through all the roads. That's insane. But having lots of roads is still useful, so we can decide on the best course of action. In software roadmaps, we have, hey, we need to do all of this stuff. And kind of with something like this, we have survivability, because each of these things, well, you know, if a road is blocked, if there's a lot of traffic, there's lots of other options. We kind of don't spend too much, we go into the next street. And about 15 years ago, we started changing how we use these roadmaps to implement the third principle that Hartford talks about. So I don't know about you, but I generally kind of have a problem with driving, because I never learned how to drive. I don't have a driving license. And what kind of the way my wife and I, our girlfriend, then used to kind of plan things is 15 years ago we'd kind of look at, you know, a map, and then we'd draw the exact route we want to go through. And then she would drive, I would be sitting on the seat next to the driver, trying to flip the book as kind of, you know, we're passing and see, oh, this is the sign. And then very quickly we'd get into an argument who is an idiot for not knowing how to drive, or who is a moron for not knowing how to read, or whose reflexes are like a dead horse, so they couldn't turn left when I said turn left, and things like that. And then we get into all these stupid kind of discussions, and at the end, when we're completely lost, we have to stop. We have to go and find a coffee shop somewhere and ask somebody to tell us where we are on the map, and then we have to replan all over again. And half an hour later, we're in some other coffee shop, hopefully slightly closer to destination, doing the same thing. About 10, 15 years ago, we bought a marriage-saving device, something like this. So we no longer have to argue who's a moron, who is not a moron, who can read or who cannot read. This thing tells us where we are on the map. If a road is blocked, this thing tells us, hey, go and take the next road. Everybody's using Waze here. Kind of, you know, Waze is telling you, you know, don't go through this road. It's not a good option. Go through some other road. And it will automatically correct, automatically replan. And the big benefit of this is kind of the turn-by-turn navigation. We had the maps before. We could measure distances before. We had kilometers per hour before. But the big thing the GPS brought is turn-by-turn navigation. This is what we're missing for software. If you're measuring stuff with story points, you're measuring kilometers per hour. Now imagine driving a car where you had no other information apart from how many kilometers per hour you're doing. That's how we're driving software projects. That's insane. That is completely insane. And we need to build this kind of turn-by-turn navigation. We need something that on a shorter time scale tells me, yes, this is a good idea or not a good idea. And this is where we go back to kind of the Underpants-Gnomes question and trying to answer that. So Anthony's big conclusion is that if we want to measure something on a shorter time scale and want to measure value, that kind of behavior changes are potentially valuable. If you can make somebody do something faster, better, cheaper, easier, that's potentially bringing value. And the interesting thing about a behavior change is we can observe and measure behavior changes on a shorter time scale. If we focus our software deliveries correctly, we can say, oh, these 5 reports over here are for people to be able to identify exceptions faster. How much faster? I don't know. 5%, 10%, 20%. So then I can actually measure before and after whether people are detecting exceptions faster. And Anthony's big conclusion, so if you remember one thing from today and you forget everything else, remember this thing. Anthony's big conclusion is that if you can describe your pieces of work so they're focused on a behavior change, you can fix the Underpants-Gnomes problem. You can put something shorter term in between that tells you not whether you've implemented it correctly, but whether what you've implemented is actually delivering any value. And this is where kind of we have another bit of problem is when we talk about valuable, the big question is valuable to whom and valuable how. There's lots of value levels, lots of types of value. Mark Schwartz in his book, The Art of Business Value, talks about at least 3 different types of business value. There's value for the users, people that interact with the system. There's value for customers. Those are people who pay for it. And there's value for kind of the organization that's operating or delivering the software. There's 3 different types of value. If you look at kind of somebody like Google, everybody in this room is probably a user of Google. And when you go to the Google homepage, the critical mission you have, the key value for you is to find relevant information quickly. The quicker, the better. But we're not the customers. The customers are people paying for advertising, and the critical value for them is distracting you on that journey to find relevant information quickly and sending you to see the information they want you to see. It's completely opposite of what you want. And then there's a value for Google as a company that needs to balance out these 2 forces. And actually there's a brilliant story from Google called 40 Shades of Blue. I strongly recommend people kind of look up on the internet and read, because it's one of those rare stories where you can read both sides of the puzzle. And kind of what happened is about kind of 7 or 8 years ago, the head of design at Google wanted to change the color of the links on the Google homepage. And they were looking at, well, how do I test this? And said, well, I will compare this to the CSS value. I will look at whether it's this CSS value, and if it is, then it's okay. But how do I know this is a good idea? He said, well, the color theory says this is kind of much more noticeable than the current color. So it's all about the work we do. And then they were smart enough to ask the question, well, how does this change somebody's behavior? Forget about what we need to do. How does this change somebody's behavior? How do I measure that this was actually a good idea? And they came up with a measurement that, well, people will click on more links because they're more noticeable. So now we have a behavior change. And Google being Google, what the developers did that night is they delivered 40 different colors of blue. And they measured the difference. And as a result of that, the head of design, depending whose side you read, either quit or was fired. Because the color he chose would actually kind of damage the profit by $250 million over a year. Although the color theory said this is a good color, maybe, cheap Chinese telephones don't render it like you would get with an expensive Pantone printer. I don't know. There's lots of reasons why it couldn't be like that, but they measured the behavior change. And they were able to kind of prevent themselves from falling into this trap. So kind of this is where we have not just one level of value, but multiple levels of value. And we need to start looking at, well, something might be useful to people, but is it actually successful for us as well? You know, how do we define this stuff? And this is where we need to start looking at the value for users and the value for the company as well. And when you start looking at that, this is where Hartford talks about as hierarchical backlogs, not linear backlogs. We have a backlog of things where we have some business goal for the company on the top, and then we have the answer to the Underpants-Gnomes question. How does this impact our users? How does it impact our customers? What is the behavior change there? And then below you have epic stories and everything else. And this is how to do proper backlogs, because then we can talk about, well, you know, if you have 20 different business change ideas to achieve a goal, and if the first one does it, we are done. If we have 20 different epics that are supposed to make people click on more links, and the first 3 epics get us to where we need, we don't need to do the other 17. Those are the roads we don't need to take. We've arrived at a destination. Or if the first 3 or 4 behavior changes don't get us closer to destination, maybe there's something wrong. Maybe we need to replan. So we need this hierarchy in order to plan effectively. And this is where impact maps come in. Impact maps are basically a visualization of this, just connected as a mind map, where we kind of turn it on the side. We have a business goal in the middle of a mind map. We have the groups of people we want to kind of impact. And then we have how should their behavior change to kind of start achieving this goal. And then we have all the deliverable stories and things like that at the end. So impact maps are a fantastic visualization technique that help us figure out what is the vision of what we want to deliver and how do we measure it. And they help us answer the Underpants-Gnomes question. So one of the big things here is that there's a very, very clear split between our sphere of influence, kind of things where we have lots of assumptions about, and our zone of control, things that we actually kind of can control. And every connection here becomes an assumption. Every connection here becomes something we can test, validate, we can use to prove whether this thing is a good idea or not. So this brings lots of really good discussions around, well, is this thing valuable? How is it valuable? What do we, you know, how do we measure that where we're going is actually kind of the right thing to do? And this helps with what Tim Brown, in his book Change by Design, that started the whole design thinking thing, talked about as the key purpose of business analysis. Tim Brown in Change by Design says that kind of most organizations don't do business analysis correctly. Not software organizations, other like industry. He says for most organizations, business analysis is figuring out the details of something that some stakeholder already said this is a good thing to do. And at this point, we're just wasting time. Tim Brown said the kind of true purpose of business analysis is kind of on this line between kind of creating lots of options that we might want to do and choosing which of these options are actually valuable to do. And he said that if you're not doing kind of that line over there, you're not really doing good business analysis. You're just kind of going into the details of something that somebody already chose. So for most teams that are kind of doing Agile, the role of the product owner kind of moved away more to prioritization, and the role of analysis got delegated to the whole team. That's where kind of Agile is going. And now, you know, instead of just taking, oh, this thing is good, this thing is good, this thing is good because some stakeholder told me they want that, this is what we need to start doing. And the third thing that impact maps do incredibly well is impact maps help people keep their focus on the goal all the time. And if there is a cheaper, better, faster solution to achieve something, we actually go and do that. Because we understand this kind of big context. I worked with a big bank in the Nordics where they were going to do this 2-year project with I don't know how many hundreds of people to rewrite 20 different systems to one system that rules them all, to be amazingly good, replace everything. Of course, it wouldn't work like that. But then when we figured out what are the behavior changes people actually wanted to achieve, they realized that they could achieve the critical behavior change with an Excel spreadsheet and a website and delivered that in about 3 weeks. After that, they looked at this big project and said, well, you know, do we really need this anymore? And decided to cancel the whole thing. So having a focus on the goal is really, really important. Now, kind of with impact maps, as we've used it over the last, 8 or 9 years, in the community, we've already kind of started seeing how people misuse them. And this is what kind of I want to give you a couple of ideas. If you want to try something like this, how to kind of skip over 7 years of learning. And most of these things are actually applicable even without impact maps. You can apply them directly to stories. Like at Google, they've not used impact maps, but they've looked at measuring behavior change. They achieved kind of the same value. So the first big problem with impact maps that I see with teams is an overloaded zone of control. What that means is you have a map that looks like this. Kind of, there's one goal, one actor, one behavior change, and then 700 things to do, because people just took a Jira backlog and reverse engineered it. The second big problem kind of people tend to have is actors that are too generic. This is like those user stories that say, as a user, I want something. Like, who is that user? What do they want? What do they need? How do you even decide on that? And this kind of, you can see this shape of a map because you have users or customers or somebody like that. And then the third big problem we kind of keep seeing with impact maps is immutable behaviors, where the things that should answer the Underpants-Gnomes question are not behavior changes, they are behaviors. If you have a story that said, as a inventory manager, in order to monitor my inventory levels, I need this report, that's talking about the behavior. It's not talking about the change. There's no victory condition. You don't know after you deliver your story whether you have done something good or not. But if you talk about monitor my inventory faster, cheaper, easier, then you can actually measure the difference. So we need behavior changes. This is again where we have these kind of behaviors like buy, download, and that's a really, really big problem. So a colleague of mine called Christian Hassa, who works for Tech Talk in Vienna, and I've designed a couple of facilitation techniques for people to get started with this thing easier and to avoid these three most common problems. And I said you can probably use these techniques even if you don't want to use impact mapping, they will create some value for you. So the first technique that we started designing is called the revenue stream map. We've modeled it based on the innovation games from Luke Homan, because I think those visual innovation kind of games, or if you work for a large company, facilitation techniques, are really, really useful to get people to be more creative about something. So revenue stream map is a metaphorical facilitation technique. What that means is that it gets people to think about something they already know, to be more creative about something you want them to kind of think about, by providing a visual metaphor. And in this case, the visual metaphor is a city that needs clean water to survive. And the city represents your project or your kind of milestone or your product, and the clean water represents all the possible revenue streams, all the possible ways of kind of getting money into this. And then you can break it down, break it down, break it down, break it down. Most people kind of know where revenue is coming from, so we're going to use this to come up with all the different types of users or actors that are the sources of the streams. In the sources of the streams, when you break it down and break it down, break it down, you avoid creating generic users, generic customers, you get really, really detailed kind of customer groups. So we have these pre-printed cards that kind of we let people do with kind of sources of streams, and then at the end you throw away the map, but you keep the kind of cards with the source of the streams. They become a really good start of a discussion who can help achieve a business goal, where, you know, whose behavior can we change. So we have these kind of three steps for this. So the first one is to identify all the tributaries. How do kind of the revenue streams break down? That takes about 10-15 minutes. And then the second one is identify the sources of the streams to fill up these cards. Who are the key contributors? And the third one is to identify all the kind of possible damaging customers, all the possible damaging actors, like competition, like regulators, like people who can obstruct us achieving the goal. And we have two types of factories for this. The first type of factory is a factory that pumps dirty water directly into the streams. So those are direct polluters, like customers, like people preventing you from doing work. And there's also kind of factories that pump dirty air into the air, which are kind of not a big problem now, but if the wind changes, they might become a problem, so we need to monitor them. Those are like big partners or platforms you're using and things like that. And all that helps identify lots of different kind of actors we can do. And then after that, we start looking at how do we kind of avoid this problem of describing behaviors. How do we focus on behavior changes? So for each of those cards, we organize people kind of to have a kind of a competitive facilitation technique or competitive game called impact cards. So competitive facilitation techniques get people to kind of be more creative by having to kind of compete for points, so having to kind of win over the kind of the rest of the group. And the idea with this is kind of people get lots of cards with kind of templates like this. Somebody will do something instead of something else, so there is a change. And you kind of, we organize that in groups of 7 or 8, and the first person puts their card in the middle of the table, then anybody else can put a card that's for the same actor but a different behavior change. And kind of the last person who places a card on the top of the stack when nobody has any more cards wins the whole thing and wins that many points. And then you can declare, you know, that's a chocolate or something like that. And what this leads to is, in the first 5 minutes, you have all the usual behavior changes: cheaper, faster, easier, better, blah, blah. And then you have a stack with 10 cards, and then people really need to be creative to put another one on top. And you come up with really interesting kind of ideas how you can change people's behavior. And of course, you're not going to keep 90% of it, but you've spent 10 minutes exploring behavior changes. And then later, kind of, we organize them in terms of effort and impact, and choose which ones to work on. So there's a couple of templates. One is like this: so, you know, enterprise users will solve login issues on their own instead of calling support. That's a potential behavior change. The other template we use is something like this, where somebody will do something differently. And again, it's the change that's important. That's what the template is kind of requiring people to do. So, you know, the settlement team will discover exceptions 30% faster. And that's where kind of really, really interesting discussion starts. So, as a conclusion, if you remember one thing from my talk, remember that behavior changes are a potential unit of value. And if you can flip your user stories, if you can flip your backlog items so that they describe a behavior change, not a type of work, but a behavior change, you will be able to measure on a shorter time scale whether the proposed solution is actually a good idea or not. So we can start discarding things that are not good ideas. We can start discovering unexpected things that, you know, the head of design thinks this is the best color in the world, but actually it's not. And we can kind of go in a much better direction. Kind of these two techniques help us identify the actors we want to change, and the behavior changes, they help us answer the Underpants-Gnomes question. So kind of all of this stuff is online. It's completely open source. The templates are open source. The facilitation techniques are open source. If you go to github.com/impact mapping, it's explained in a lot more detail, and you can download the artwork and kind of try to run it in your company. And I strongly suggest you do something like that. Now, that's pretty much it. I have 2 more minutes until my time is up, but I think we should take a break. And so thank you very much. I hope this challenged your thinking at least a bit.